this concept of life and his approach to understanding living beings. Then I will move to his idea of autonomy. In the third part, I will discuss variation. In the fourth, the principle of correlation. And finally, I will talk about analogies, thinking in analogies as a central principle in Goethe and later Goethean biologists. So I get started with cognizing life. I would like to begin with an image. For in Goethe's theory of knowledge, perception or seeing plays a central role. An image, a diagram by Goethe himself, that is intended to explain the term life, bringing together thinking and perception.
The slides aren't changing.
Hang on, wait. They will. They have
Yeah, there it is.
No, they will.
No, the diagram. We need the diagram. This one. Life is represented here as the sum or the resultant of two groups of concepts. The first series consists of words that denote a dynamic and can be understood as active principles: capacity, power, force, striving, drive. The second consists of the polarity of matter and form, that is, two initially static relationships. The series of active principles is arranged in such a way that the unspecific term capacity is closest to the unformed matter, while the directed drive is closest to form. Here is already clear that Goethe thinks of the concept of life in terms of tensions and relations. He does not fix it to one meaning, but locates it in a conceptual field of elementary terms. Goethe's approach towards non-human living beings has been described by many scholars. Following these authors, one important point in Goethe's method is that in his approach to understanding living beings, different heterogeneous cognitive abilities are involved simultaneously, above all thinking and viewing. View in thinking and think in viewing is how Rudolf Steiner characterized Goethe's approach, based on Goethe's morphology, for which the concept of the type is fundamental, a gestalt that can give unity to manifold forms but cannot be directly perceived. Steiner wrote in his outlines of an epistemology of Goethe's worldview from 1886, I quote the translation that Christoph provided. Our mind must work much more intensively in grasping the type than in grasping the inorganic natural law. It must generate not only the form, but also the content. It must undertake an activity that, in inorganic natural science, is performed by the senses, and which we call intuition. At this higher level, the mind itself must therefore be intuitive. Our power of judgment must view in thinking and think in viewing. Here, as Goethe first set out, we are dealing with an intuitive power of judgment. Some years earlier, in his introduction to Goethe's natural scientific writings, Steiner applied this form of approaching the living being not only to morphology and the idea of a type, but also to that of an organism. I think I have no slide for that. The idea of the organism is active as an entelechy in the organism, in the form grasped by our reason. It is the essence of the entelechy itself. It does not summarize experience, it brings about that which is to be experienced. In my view, this interpretation of Goethe's understanding of the organism is not so far away from Kant's. For Kant, as for Goethe, the organism is not given in the senses, but only by the means of mental faculties that Kant called teleological reflection, and Goethe intuition. Teleological reflection in Kant serves an identificatory function, as Marcel Quarfoot has called it in his 2006 paper on Kant's biological teleology. Teleological reflection plays the role of singling out objects as natural purposes, whereby the special science of biology is constituted. In this paper, Quarfoot wrote, Kant's use of teleology in biology should be seen primarily as serving the function of identifying objects as biological. There is also a quasi-explanatory role for teleology, which concerns the indispensability of the teleological viewpoint as a principle of order, serving as a substitute for the ordinary scientific explanation in terms of mechanism, that according to Kant is not attainable in the case of the organism, because of the mechanically unaccountable harmony of the organization of its parts. Though these roles for teleology are closely entwined, I consider the identificatory one the more significant. It does not aim to replace explanation, but rather to demarcate a special kind of objects conceived of as a functional unit, functional units. In my dissertation that appeared 2 years earlier in 2004, I also argued for this position. So I think, as Quarfoot does, that according to Kant, the most important role for reflective judgment is to provide a particular natural science, biology, with its object, the organism, as a functionally closed, causally circular system. It is only through our capacity for reflection on nature that we arrive at the entities we judge to be organisms. These are not simply given. Rather, cognizing them in their unity is an achievement of our cognition. Already in Kant, therefore, we can find a convergence of object and subgroup, and that is so prominent in late Romantic philosophy of nature. However, there are substantial differences in Kant's and Goethe's approaches to understanding living beings. Most importantly, Kant was not, like Goethe, an empiricist, or he wasn't as near to the empiricist as Goethe was, at least. Cognition, according to Kant, does not get started with phenomenologically given objects, but with an interaction of mental faculties, categories, or ideas, such as the idea of a natural purpose and sensual data. I would like to compare the two approaches more in detail, referring to a recent paper by Christoph Huck, in which he characterized Goethe's natural scientific approach in 4 steps. The 3 first steps in Christoph's reconstruction of Goethe's approach belong closely together. They are the following. First, Goethe's method is empirical and phenomenological. It is based on careful and committed observation and prudent collection of the phenomena to be investigated. Second, Goethe's method proceeds from the empirical phenomena to their imaginative connection and alteration by what he called exact sensorial imagination. Third, Goethe's method yields experiences which promote insights into formative laws that govern the phenomena. These 3 steps would not be true for Kant's approach, as Kant is not an empiricist. He does not proceed from the empirical phenomena, as they are not just given, but constituted by the understanding, and in the case of organisms, by reflective judgment. I am not sure whether these steps really are true for Goethe, because for Goethe as well, the phenomena, at least the Urphenomena, are explanatory valuable types, and they do not simply exist in nature, but are co-created by our mental activities and nature in Goethe's participatory approach. This is stressed in Christoph's 4th step. Fourth, Goethe's method is intuitive and productive. It allows to judge natural phenomena from the whole to the parts by an intuitive power of judgment. Intuitive understanding, in the Goethean sense, seeing the essential form of an organism with the eye of Instead, it must be grasped through mental productivity. In this description, Goethe's approach is similar to Kant's. Mental productivity allows to see the whole. However, Goethe surely is much more of an empiricist than Kant. His attention is focused on the phenomena and their transformation in time, and he thinks of the observer as a participant, not as a cognizing subject distinct from the object under investigation. The importance of seeing, observing, and participating is also evident in Goethe and Goethean biologists, in that they enjoy traveling, seeing things, and then capturing what they see in images, photographs, or in most cases, their own drawings. The books by Wolfgang Schad and Andreas Suchentke in particular are full of images from all corners of the earth. The drawings do not only depict isolated animal bodies, but especially in the case of Andreas Suchentke, also show the animals embedded in their habitat, or the visual impression of entire landscapes. The landscapes are attributed a characteristic signature or physiognomy. The parts and the whole are connected by correspondences, each part functioning as a synecdoche for the whole. I will return to this later in the section on correlations. In any case, it can be said that this Goethean love of travel and images stand in stark contrast to Kant's desire to stay put. Kant is, after all, the anti-hero of locomotion and traveling, preferring to remain where he was, where he found himself born in Königsberg. A common ground that is shared by Kantians and Goetheans is their recognition of the autonomy of living beings. In both approaches, a living being is understood as a self-containing whole, consisting of harmoniously interlocking parts. Appropriate knowledge, therefore, does not proceed from isolating analysis, but from observing and approaching the unique self-referential dynamics of living beings, in which they are experienced according to their own laws. Goethe describes his method of approaching living wholes poetically in a fragment. Ironically, Goethe's most precise account of living wholes is given in an incomplete elliptic sentence. The way of looking at natural products in themselves, without reference to their usefulness or purpose, without relation to their first creator, merely as living wholes, which, precisely because they are living, already contain cause and effect within themselves, to which we can therefore approach and demand an account, which we can trust to give us information about the nature of their existence. In this piece, Goethe clearly follows Kant in the description of the causal working order of living wholes consisting of interdependent parts, a reciprocity of cause and effect. The main focus, however, is on the inherent laws, spontaneity, and unpredictability of life. The living refers to a self-sufficient object insofar as it is not integrated into a context of utilization, but exists for itself, is not used, and is not made subservient. The wording in this fragment by Goethe has some connections to what his friend Friedrich Schiller wrote in his essay on naive and sentimental poetry in 1795. In this essay, Schiller claims famously that we love the calm, autonomous activity of creatures of nature, the existence according to their own laws, in their inner necessity, the eternal unity with themselves. In another description of life phenomena as self-referential processes, Goethe formulates a teleological circularity in the question and answer about the meaning or purpose of life. The purpose of life is life itself, as Goethe put it in 1796 in a letter to Meyer. Goethe's definition of physiology in these years also points into this direction. It simply states physiology, interaction of living parts. Later in 1822, in his Maxims and Reflections, he gives kind of a definition of life, which is life, the rotating movement of the monas around itself, which knows neither rest nor repose. Finally, in his morphological writings, Goethe's holism is evident in the fact that he usually does not name morphological objects by means of intrinsic characteristics, but rather makes relational determinations. For example, he names a morphological element in relation to others. For example, in his botanical studies, he frequently uses the terms part and organ. In Goethe's descriptive language, morphology, therefore, always establishes a reference to the organism as a whole. Morphology is geared toward analyzing functional aspects of the interaction of parts within the organism as a whole. From Goethe's morphological perspective, therefore, the interpretation of organisms as mere aggregates of parts that can be freely combined, with one another is rejected, and the interdependence of the parts and the unity of the entire system of the organism, the correlation of parts, is emphasized. Autonomy is also a central theme for Goethean biologists of the 20th and 21st centuries. Friedrich Kipp, for example, discusses in his short essay on species preservation and individualization in the animal kingdom from 1941, and states that in the course of evolution, there has been a progressive emancipation of the organism from external bonds, with the organism becoming less and less subject to external chance. And he believes that the perfection of individuality is one of the most significant phenomena in the history of the species. Since the early 21st century, Bernd Roslenbroich has written several essays and a book on autonomy and its increase in the course of evolution. He discusses the possibility of increasing autonomy, emancipation from environment, and evolution of an internal environment which is both more flexible and more independent of outer changes. The third topic I would like to discuss is variation. Variation is an important theme for Goethe, both in terms of language and objects. With regard to language, in his morphological writings, Goethe's avoidance of strict terminology is striking. Instead of terminological phrases, he often uses different words for the same thing, which he understands as constantly changing. His style is therefore characterized by synonym variation. This style of variation enables him to eliminate and circle around a subject from different angles, leaving it open in a sense rather than fixing it in place. Uwe Pörksen, who has studied Goethe's language in detail, speaks of Goethe's skepticism towards language. In this sense, Goethe criticizes the term Gestalt, which he himself used frequently. If we consider all forms, especially organic ones, we find that nowhere is there anything that remains the same. Anything that is at rest, anything that is complete, but rather that everything fluctuates in constant motion. As Goethe elsewhere writes, it is a matter of catching phenomena, erhaschen, only attempting to fix them while remaining versatile. For Goethe, language should remain variable and flexible because the object it describes are also variable and flexible. Just as forms themselves are constantly changing, morphology for Goethe is not a static theory of form, but rather an essentially dynamic morphology. The theory of form is the theory of transformation, he writes. The doctrine of metamorphosis is the key to all signs of nature. Metamorphosis, thus, appears as a fundamental principle of nature, manifesting itself in the modification of basic forms, for example, through the expansion and contraction of parts and other types of transformation. In particular, in the metamorphosis of plants, Goethe recognizes a secret relationship between the various external parts of plants, which develop after each other and, as it were, out of each other. so that one and the same organ can be seen to change in manifold ways. For Goethe, the theory of metamorphosis also represents a countermodel to hierarchical classification systems such as Linnaeus' system of nature. Even this very notion, Systema Naturae, is significantly rejected by Goethe. According to him, the natural order is not revealed by a classification system based on the number and configuration of parts, as in Linnaeus, but rather by the process of change in nature. In order to organize the variable and constantly changing forms, Goethe developed ideas about an anatomical type of animal, which contained a proposal, as he put it, for a general image in which the forms of all animals, as far as possible, would be contained, and according to which each animal could be described in a certain order. The type is a model for the spatial arrangement of the body parts of an organism, a diagram of the relative positions of its body parts. Goethe associates this concept of type less with the thesis of a genealogical descent of animals, as Darwin later did. For Goethe, the blueprint, or the general scheme or framework, as he calls it, has the primary function of representing the organism in its entirety and the correlative unity of its parts. The correlative unity of the body leads back to the autonomy of the organism. In other respects, correlation in Goethe's work concerns the comparability of different body plans with each other and also the relationship of organisms and their environment. I first turn to the first of these. Oh, sorry, I haven't shown you that. Well, yeah, sorry. Goethe's comparison of body plans reveals correlative changes in the structural components of the whole. A change in one part entails a change in another. For example, an increase in the size of one part of the body is accompanied by a decrease in the size of another. Goethe codified this relationship as the law of the household. In one formulation, it suggests that nothing can be added to one part without taking something away from another, and vice versa. The creative impulse is established here as the ruling principle in a realm that is limited but well organized. The categories of his budget, into which his expenditure is to be distributed, are prescribed for him, but he is free to a certain extent to decide how to allocate it. If he wants to allocate more to one category, he is not entirely prevented from doing so, but he is obliged to immediately reduce something else. And thus nature can never fall into debt or even become bankrupt. Goethe explains this idea of economical giving and taking in nature using a few examples. In the typological but necessarily genealogical biological series of snake, lizard, and frog, not necessarily genealogical, there is an increasing shortening of the body, accompanied by a lengthening of the extremities. Next to this series of forms stands the toad type, which can be developed from the frog type through a widening of the body combined with a compensatory shortening of the legs. Adolf Meyer-Abich described this general type of law in 1949 as the law of compensation and sees it as the first holistic fundamental law of modern biology. Although Aristotle already had similar ideas. In addition to the correlations between the parts of an organism that constitute its unity and the correlation between different animal forms, the relationship between the organism and its environment has also been described as a correlation. Mid-20th century biologists standing in the Goethean tradition studied various of these correlative relationships between organisms and their respective environments. For example, correspondences are seen between the structural richness of bird songs and the habitat of birds. Within the group of reed warblers in Central Europe, birds of species that prefer to live in monotonous habitats also have the most monotonous song. And birds that live near water, for example, wagtails and plovers, often perform a nodding, wave-like movement of the body that corresponds to the movement of the water. The third example is the upright, rigid posture of the bittern, which you can see here. That is explained by the psychological affinity of the species to its habitat, as Kip calls it, and an adaptation to the structure of the reeds, this upright posture. All of this is seen as a harmonious relationship between the animal and its environment. Goethean biologists have always stressed the importance of the embeddedness of an organism into its environment. To understand an animal, you always have to look at its environment. And this is because animals are deeply intertwined with their environment. You can read in a book by Kranich. And Craig Holdridge also wants to open our eyes for organisms' embeddedness in the environment. He pleads for a shift from traditional notion of separate biological organisms to the concept of ecological organisms, or of which the biological organisms are part. I quote, "The organism is interaction with other organisms within the context of a habitat. The single organism or species that is supposed to compete with others does not exist. It is far more appropriate to view organisms as members of a differentiable whole that has never dissolved into discrete entities." And finally, as we have already seen in some examples of thinking in the Goethean tradition, there are not only correlations, but also analogies. The concept of organism can be transferred to the whole Earth, or even the cosmos, as we heard yesterday. And it has also been applied by Goethean biologists to landscapes. This is done, for example, by Andreas Suchantke in his book on ecogeography. Suchantke sees landscapes as coherent, having an own inherent structure, a totality, characteristic signature or physiognomy, ecological gestalt, with an integrated interplay of all its living and non-living parts. He thinks of landscapes as organisms, not so much because the parts are interdependent, but because of a principle of correspondence. The expression of this signature, the physiognomy of the landscape, is not confined to the large-scale features of a landscape, but lives also in what might appear to be, but lives on, this signature lives in what might appear to be its smallest and most significant details. So you can find the signature in the whole and in the details. The rich upholstery, he writes, of moss and the large, delicately textured leaves of the herbaceous plants and ferns that form the typical scene in a moist, shady forest would never be found in rocky landscapes exposed to direct sunlight, extremes of heat and cold, and long periods of drought. Suchantke extends this view of thinking even to the dimension of a continent, arguing that even a continent is not just a coincidental spatial aggregate, but a functionally differentiated whole, an organism. In Africa, for example, we have, according to Suchantke, the life pole of the equatorial rainforest and the death pole of the desert. Between these two poles, Suchantke identifies the savanna as a mediator, combining and balancing the two extremes. The mediator is characterized by a cycle of rhythmic processes between diminished life in the dry and the flourishing in the wet season. Suchantke also proposed to understand the three types of landscape in Africa as three phases in the aging of the continental organism. The rainforest being dominated by processes typical of the juvenile growth phase of an organism, the savanna representing the African landscape in the peak of maturity, with pure growth processes held within bounds and balanced by the presence of diverse creatures, and finally the old growth stage of the desert, where the seasonal rhythm slows down and all life forms are diminished. This is thinking in analogies, I think. However, I'm not sure whether the threefold division of the group of mammals, which we saw yesterday by Wolfgang Schad, 1971, that we discussed, is a type of an analogy. At least it does not seem to be an analogy in the biological sense of the term, because biological analogies are due to adaptation. They are adaptive complexes. There have been some very elaborate attempts to describe biological analogies as adaptations or life form complexes. The most comprehensive system, presented in 2 thick volumes, was developed by Hans-Werner Köpke. In this attempt to develop a universally valid biological theory, this is the undertitle, Köpke distinguishes between adaptation complexes classified according to 6 major functional groups, which are locomotion, nutrition, protection, reproduction, parental care, and social behavior. Similarities between organisms from different evolutionary lineages arise from the fact that organisms develop similar adaptations, such as the torpedo shape of fish, ichthyosaurs, penguins, and whales that you can see here. According to Köpke, these similarities based on parallel adaptation enable a classification system that is independent of phylogenetic relationships. Köpke contrasts this ahistorical biology of analogies with a historical biology of homologies. In addition to the study of life forms, his biology of analogies includes physiology, genetics, and ecology, which provide general explanatory principles, while historical phylogenetic process of life on Earth. Goethean or Goetheanist biology does not seem to belong to either biology of analogy or biology of homologies. This is because it deals with forms of order other than those that have arisen either through descent or adaptation. An open question for me is whether the Goethean approach can be considered part of biology at all. For I do not yet see on what principles it is based, how the tripartite division of mammals, for example, can be objectively justified, or what methods exist for specifying the signature of a landscape and finding them again in the individual phenomena of the landscape. I'm inclined to see these forms of order more in terms of aesthetic than scientific considerations. And the discussion on music might point in that direction as well. In summary, this framework of 4 concepts, autonomy, variation, correlation, and analogy, might provide a basis for both a philosophy of the organic and for the empirical study of organisms. Questions remain as to how these 4 concepts are precisely related, whether they should be expanded, and whether they can be understood as a kind of categories for understanding living beings. And finally, what specific perspectives they enable us to gain on the organic world. Thank you.